Hello everyone, it is Joe here from OmniPoke, the channel that brings you guys everything Pokemon. If you're looking for PTCG live codes, make sure you check out the Poketown store. You can get a 5% discount on your orders using that code OmniPoke. For today's video, we're going to be going over the 2025 Pokemon TCG structure for the Worlds invite as well as the season in general. A lot of changes coming into the new season. Some of them I think are absolute home run, no-brainer, amazing upgrades. Some a lot more debatable, and we'll be getting into the pros and cons of those decisions as we go through the video. First of all, I'm going to give you a rundown of all the information that we received today from the official Pokemon website, comparing the 2024 to 25 seasons. Let's start off with the big one then. Getting to the World Championships is no longer going to be a championship point bar required to qualify. Now we are going to have a region-based top X amount of players, simply make it based on their leaderboard ranking within their own age division and their own region. So you can see on the far right, for the Masters division, there's going to be 125 players in NA and EU. The top 125 players performing, still based on championship points earned at these tournaments, will immediately get their invitation to Worlds, and no one else will. LATAM, it's 100 players. OC probably getting the worst deal, where now only 20 players from that region can get an invite, and there's going to be 10 players invited from the Middle East as well as South Africa. However, just like the previous season, there is also that automatic invite for first place finishers at regionals and special events, as well as increased from just the winner now to the top 4 of the international finishers will get an immediate invite to the World Championships, and these tournament winners will be in addition to the top 125 within their region. So for example, if Tord Reklev wins an international championships and he finishes within the top 125 of EU, he's not taking away a spot from anyone, he's essentially stripped from that ranking. Championship points for him then only matters in terms of getting travel awards. His name is then sort of removed from that top 125 list, so you're not having to compete against him. We also got this kind of cryptic but interesting paragraph as well, where alongside the new Worlds qualification bar, there is also going to be a championship points season reward program. They really haven't given us much information on this, but as you can see, it will operate similarly to the fixed CP threshold from recent years for getting Worlds invites, but by the sounds of things, it's going to be probably more like a ladder system rather than just one set bar throughout the entire year. I'm imagining a variety of different prizes that we can earn throughout the season, be it promos, be it playmats, be it plushies, and other such goodies at the end of the season based on how many championship points you earned. They've also freshened up the acquisition of championship points throughout the season. Now, there has been no changes to League Cup or League Challenge CP earnings. However, the best finish limit has been decreased to 4. The bigger changes coming from the regional and international championship level, where the point earnings from regionals and international championships have been increased. Like I said, winning a regional or getting top 4 at an international championship still does get you that guaranteed invite, so these points are really just here for your travel awards. But in many ways, the bigger change is that there is now a shared best finish limit between ICs and regionals and SPEs. Between all of these higher tier events, there is a best finish limit now of 6. Previously, international championships had no BFL, whereas in 2025, they are going to be a combined best finish limit. Just for a very quick comparison, from locals now, the maximum we can get is 260 championship points combined between cups and challenges if we get 4 first place finishes in each of them, which is 130 less points that we could have earned at the local level in 2024. And at the same time, you can see the percentage increase for regional and international payouts, essentially making the Worlds invite chase, or just the acquisition of championship points in general, weighted much more heavily towards these higher tier events. You'll notice the percentage increase is also not equal between the sort of top X placements. In fact, it's a much higher weighting towards the higher end of finishes at both the regional and international championship level, which essentially means if you do better at tournaments in the 2025 season, it's going to be more beneficial than if you had done the same placement in the previous year. So generally, this is rewarding the best records, the best players at any given tournament, while still giving a very generous sum to those lower placements. We've also seen that there is increased booster pack pricing for our player base. This can actually go all the way down to top 512 now, so thinking about large-scale regionals and international championships, if you've reached top 512, you now actually get 9 booster packs, which is a really substantial portion of the player base going to a tournament, and that scales up really nicely with top 256, top 128, top 64 finishes. Essentially, they've made it less grueling of a cutoff of either cash and boosters or basically nothing. So generally, I feel the sentiment around attending these tournaments will result in many more players feeling like they've come away with something from the weekend. Although we are gaining more booster packs, the actual cash pricing has remained unchanged this season. There was an error on their initial post, but don't worry, it has been confirmed. The cash pricing is exactly the same as it was last year. They've also changed the International Championship travel pricing with a breakdown here for top 4, top 8, top 16, and now top 32. Although they don't get cash towards their international, players will at the very least get that priority registration for the tournament. As you can see, there's also a breakdown whether the international is within your region or outside of it, and whether you're over or below 18 years of age. There's also a drastic change to our Swiss and Top Cut going into the 2025 season. Firstly, there's going to be the introduction of asymmetrical Top Cut. That means that competitors that have the equivalent match points to the 8th highest player in the standings after the Swiss rounds will then enter a single elimination bracket where we will whittle down all the way to the finals. In order to accommodate this asymmetrical top cut, there are going to be fewer Swiss rounds, often in day 1 and 2 for our players. Additionally, the match point thresholds will be changing to progress into day 2 of the competition. Previously, in 9-round tournaments, we required a 6-2-1 record to make it into the second day of competition. However, now we're going to be looking at 7-2 records or equivalent for a total of 21 match points to enter the second day of competition. And this does scale down with the number of participants as well. To make the point a little clearer, let's compare it to the 2024 season. At the NAIC, there was 2,692 players in attendance, and previously we played 15 rounds of Swiss. 9 of them in day 1, 6 of them in day 2, before having a hard cutoff of 8 players. To progress to day 2 of the competition, we would have had to have got 19 match points or better. Under the new system in 2025, we now need 21 match points to progress to the second day of competition, and there will be 2 fewer Swiss rounds before we determine our asymmetrical cut. That means that those players towards the top of the standings aren't going to be affected that much, but those who are towards the bottom end do play 2 less rounds. I think it's more significant for the other 2 tournaments I have here. For the Dortmund Regional Championships in 2024, there was 1,348 players in attendance, where again, the match points required to progress from day 1 to 2 was 19, a 6-2-1 record or better, and we had 6 Swiss rounds before getting a top 8. Under the new system, we would have 1 fewer round of Swiss in day 1, while still requiring 18 match points, which is a 6-2 record or equivalent. And then we'd go into 4 Swiss rounds before determining our asymmetrical cut. That would be a total of 3 less rounds under the new system. Similar story for the Bologna SPE. It was a 1,008 player tournament, where once again we would require 21 match points rather than 19 in the previous year to make it to day 2, and in this instance we would have 3 rounds of Swiss in day 2 before going to our asymmetrical cut. That means for players that got that 7-2 record but then fell off on day 2 could potentially have played 4 less rounds of a tournament than they would have in the previous year. We did receive the entire schedule for the remainder of 2024, as well as the information for both international championships that we're getting in 2025. You can see I've done some nice colour coding here. The blue is for the NA tournaments, the green is for the EU events, and the LATAM events are in orange. I would have done a gorgeous yellow for the OCIC, but there actually aren't any tournaments on the calendar for them, at least for the remainder of 2024. In the description, I'm going to link the post from Pokemon themselves, because you can actually see exactly which venue all of these tournaments are in, so you can begin prepping your flights and hotels and everything else required outside of tournament reg. That is a huge amount of information. I wouldn't be surprised if you wanted to pause, go back, take screenshots, this, that, and the other. I tried to make the information as easy to understand as possible, and I do think there are some genuine, absolute home runs that are just huge wins from Pokemon going into the 2025 season. Firstly, the communication is absolutely incredible. Getting so much of the schedule this early really helps the player base plan for what events they want to attend. They can start booking hotels and travel while it's still nice and cheap. And this is especially the case for all the international championships, where traveling outside your own region typically costs way more. Having that info right now allows us to be nice and stingy to make the most out of our annual budget. Possibly the biggest win is the championship point reward program. I know we haven't had much information on this just yet, but theoretically this could be a game changer. The fact that championship points aren't just fairy dust that evaporate year to year and can transform into much more tangible prizing for players all the way up and down the spectrum of competitiveness is an absolute win. I can't wait to see what they've done with this rewards program. I'll admit I'm very optimistic right now without having much information, but at the very least, if I'm no longer going to be invite chasing, I'll still have a reason to want to hunt championship points throughout the year. Also, we get more booster packs, and that scales down to much lower placements. Who doesn't want to open boosters? Who doesn't want to get extra prizing? Priority reg, I know it was a hot topic earlier in 2024, so the fact that that has been resolved is fantastic. Also, just looking at the distribution of regionals and SPEs within each region, typically we have 2 to 3 weeks at the very least from tournament to tournament, which I believe is going to really help with burnout. Logistically, it's just far simpler to take off one weekend every month. And of course, if you want to go outside your region to attend one of these tournaments, there is only one weekend of crossover here, which is September the 28th and 29th, where there's a Brazilian event as well as a European tournament. So those players who do want to go outside their region are more than welcome to and can get back in time for their next local regional. The final point is also potentially quite speculative, but the EUIC date being brought forward to February is also a godsend for TCG players, where we've suffered these long 5 or 6 month formats without any card pool changes. Purely speculation, but I would expect there to be either a new set release or the rotation in time for EUIC, which means the game is going to constantly feel fresh and give us something new to test every few months. These are all the changes that I feel have basically no downside and only upside from TPCI, so we do have to give them credit where it's due. Now we get to the more controversial stuff, the things that I've said are debatably good or bad right now. I've seen a lot of negative traction around the updates from today, so I have gone over a pros and cons for the next 4 points. Just for transparency, you can see that in 2024, these are the numbers of players from each region that will be attending the World Championships compared to the new hard set rules of 125 for NA, EU, top 100 for LA, and only 20 for OC. Undoubtedly, getting your Worlds invite next year will be more difficult purely based on those numbers. Let's start with the top X invite structure rather than a CP bar. I'm going to immediately jump to the pro section, and this one isn't for the players. This one is for TPCI. If you're looking for a why has Pokemon done this, it's simply so that they can have greater control logistically and within a budget perhaps for containing the World Championships. In 2024, the largest number of players will be attending the World Championships, and that's partially because they set a bar and possibly more players than they expected ended up achieving enough points to make it to Hawaii. By setting a bar at the beginning of the season rather than a top X, TPCI were essentially hamstrung. They would cause literal outrage if they later in the season had to raise that point threshold. So it was essentially a non-option. And I've even seen in previous years, lowering a threshold can be met with equal frustration from players who didn't think their invite was possible, then being frustrated that they didn't attend tournaments earlier in the year. So with so much growth and change in the landscape of the TCG over the last couple of seasons in terms of attendance, I feel like TPCI really did have to take a grip of the situation, and a top X invite structure is exactly how you achieve this. Next, I'm going to jump over to the cons, because I do think for the players, this generally isn't a great feeling. With a more ambiguous threshold for your Worlds invite, aspiring players probably have to attend as many events as possible at the very beginning of the season, and basically just figure out where they land, rather than just cherry picking a few events throughout the calendar year and hoping that's enough for your invite. Now you kind of have to get points on the board and see where that lands you. So, for those who are actually looking to get that invite, it's probably realistic that you have to book as much as you can right now for the end of the year. There's also likely going to be a culture change. Now that we're trying to leapfrog people around us within our region, almost everyone you sit across is actually your enemy, not just in the round, but throughout the entire year. Pokemon has a unique culture celebrating other players' achievements and being genuinely excited for your friends for doing well. Even though that's still going to be the case, you're going to have that selfish side of you that thinks, damn, I really wish they hadn't done so well, they've just jumped above me. There's also generally just more anxiety and less feeling of security around your chances for qualification. Simply because fate isn't in your own hands. You could have done as well as you possibly could, it just so happened that in the last few regionals of the year, other players had insane runs and jumped above you, pushing you out of an invite. There could also be a situation where you thought you were safe, you were kind of around that 80 or so number in the rankings, and you chose not to book a certain regional. If that tournament completely fills up and you start to slip, there may not be a chance for you to get those tickets to actually get your final events in, to catch back up. Also, there's just generally like a time waste because we're spending more time not thinking about playing Pokemon to the best ability and just having fun with the game. We're spending time in spreadsheets doing that sort of game theory element, figuring out players' progress who are around you in points, how much they're expected to achieve, how much more they have to go, and where they're at with their own personal BFLs. This is time-consuming, stressful, and just generally time not thinking about Pokemon itself. Also, purely from a numbers perspective, sorry OC and LA, you seem to have been the ones shafted most by the number of attendees you can physically have at these tournaments now. I'm not saying it's any easier for EU or NA, but purely on percentages, it's rougher for these regions. Finally, with a more sort of exclusive feel around the World Championships, it's not really going to be this celebration of Pokemon that it's been compared to the previous years. It's really just going to be a high-level tournament of intense play. There are still a few other pros I do want to go over for the top X though. Like I said, there's no fear of a point threshold changing mid-season. I've been a player through many of these years where a threshold has fortunately been lowered rather than increased, but essentially, like I said earlier, that bar can basically never be increased for Pokemon, so if they get their calculations wrong at the beginning of the year, they're in deep trouble. In fact, just based on how long it took Pokemon to release the dates for Worlds, kind of shows that logistically, it was a nightmare this year, and possibly it was down to the increased attendance that they weren't expecting. This may just be a weird sensation that I'm feeling, but I also believe that there's a number of casual competitive players that will be liberated from this change, in that they no longer have to have the mindset of achieving a Worlds invite year in, year out. Personally, it's a real sigh of relief for me that the most dedicated players can push on way beyond me. I'm going to be happy attending just a handful of tournaments that I cherry pick throughout the season, and based on the points that I earn in that year, I can still come away with tangible rewards, thanks to that seasonal rewards program. I think there's been a toxic mindset around what it means to be a Worlds player over the last few seasons in Pokemon, and genuinely people are valuing their self-worth based on their championship points and whether or not they hit an invite on certain years. That's just super toxic. It's driven a wedge between competitive and casual players for many years now, and I'm hoping that this change means that only the ultra competitive can go for an invite really helps alleviate that wedge. And finally, for those players who actually make it to Worlds, their sense of achievement is going to be massive, because actually getting into that top 125 of your region is truly an insane accomplishment. You've had to spike incredibly difficult tournaments, as well as travel around the globe to make your goal a reality. And when you're actually in the tournament, you have a much better chance of getting prizing or even winning the World Championships, because there's just less players there. Sure, they're still going to be the best, but on any given day, entering a tournament with less players typically increases your odds of winning. I'll be honest, as a day one player in multiple Worlds, I felt the tournament experience hollow at times. Maybe it was more of an issue of the day one and day two system, but the fact that the World Championships, this reward for all my hard work throughout the season, was essentially being thrown into the deep end without a paddle, could leave me feeling bitter at the end of the season, where the real reward for Worlds was the fact that you got to go on holiday with a bunch of your friends and explore a new fantastic location. That's still going to be the case at every World Championships, but now the tournament itself is going to feel much nicer. Moving on to the new best finish limits as well as the point distribution. I'm going to start with the pros in this case. The first is to do with the lumping of regional and IC BFLs. With a joint limit, players who can't attend ICs can now make up some of the points with their regional finishes to offset those points lost for not attending an IC. Think about it from the perspective of a top 22 race. If you were going for that top 22 in the previous season and didn't attend an IC, everyone who did attend that tournament and gained points literally just gained those points for free, and there was no comeback mechanic for you. The fact that you can actually go to regionals, still earn points to offset the points that they earned at the IC, sure, maybe you need to have a better finish than they did, but you can end up being equivalent to the majority of the players who attended those ICs. That said, obviously ICs are busted. That was the case last season, so you can't complain if you can't go to ICs. They're still just insanely important. It is what it is. With BFLs being lowered, there's going to be less of a local grind required for your Worlds invite. Now, I do have this as both a pro and a con. The good news is, for those players that want to aspire to be Worlds attendees, simply just have to go to less locals and can focus more on larger scale events. With a best finish limit of 4 at both challenges and cups, it's likely that you're going to have to go to a combined number of like maybe 12. Whereas in 2024, I know a number of players attended maybe 20 or so of these events, just so that they could cap out their locals. The con of this is that with these players not attending locals as much, those people who are going to these local events who aren't yet integrated into the competitive scene won't really learn about the competitive scene as organically as they would if they were often seeing these high-level players entering the cups and challenges. So this change is somewhat of a pro and a con, depending on which side of the coin you're looking at. With the increase of CP mostly being at the top end for ICs and regionals, that means that looking at the leaderboard actually reflects a bigger test of skill, because those who do the best at these events get a higher return on points per event. That's also somewhat the case with a lower BFL as well, because there are fewer mediocre results which can add towards someone's point total if they simply attended many more events. It's also theoretically possible for you to attend fewer events this year, provided you're consistently placing at regionals and ICs. If you're a strong enough player, you can go to maybe like 9 events between ICs and regionals, and if you have good enough placements, you can be pretty confident that you're going to be locked in to that top X of your region. Now, obviously, it's something you'll have to monitor, but with a lower BFL, it's possible that the very best can attend fewer tournaments and still make it to Worlds, catering to those who have less time to commit to the game, but can still play it at the highest level. The other main con I see of lower BFLs actually once again lands on the local side. Attendance could be far lower with those BFLs being less, and the CP payout effectively being weaker despite the numbers themselves staying the same, because there's a percentage gain in the higher tier events. For this one, I'll lean into the season reward program once again. That's the glimmer of hope I'm holding on to keep locals propped up with incentives throughout the entire year. The final point is asymmetrical cut with fewer Swiss rounds. I'm going to start with the cons here. You're simply playing less games of Pokemon. You're committing your weekend to a tournament and you play less poke. With that, we're effectively being entertained for less hours. It also means there's an increased variance with the matchups influencing your eventual record. Effectively, you can't hit as many bad matchups and you can't hit as many good players if you want to end up progressing into day 2 of the competition, because under the new system, it is just much more punishing to receive ties and losses. On that same point, specifically with ties, some strategies or archetypes may no longer be viable simply based on the tournament structure rather than how intrinsically powerful these strategies or archetypes are. That's already a hot potato in Pokemon right now, so I'm not going to go too much into it, but essentially I think with less rounds and ties being more punishing, controlling archetypes and slower decks are hurt by this. With ties being so horrendous, it may also lead to more awkward situations where you're having to create player agreements much more often during games. This is just something that's like not nice to have to do in tournaments, even though it's completely legal, but feeling pressure to scoop to someone or expecting a scoop from the opponent and it doesn't come through will just lead to a lot of negative outcomes. However, there are some pros to the new system. There are no more bubbles, and bubbles feel terrible, trust me. If you've done everything you can to be among the top 8 and you're just simply not there, it feels like a major injustice to these players. And the other pros really are just logistics as well. With fewer rounds, that might give us the scope to increase our round timers. Rather than 50 min best of 3, maybe we get 60 mins now, and that could balance the scales of strategies or archetypes no longer being viable with less rounds to play. There's also more scope to easily accommodate the increased player numbers we've been seeing at events. There's just simply more delays the larger tournaments you have, there's more opportunities for judge calls, time extensions, and simply navigating the tournament space with more people becomes more time consuming. So the fewer rounds may indicate that we're actually going to have just larger player caps at all of these tournaments, and maybe even lead to a giant NAIC. Again, just speculation, but stripping out a round from our circuit in day 1 specifically gives our tournament organizers more time to play with. So that's it. Those are my pros and cons. I've thought a lot about everything that was announced today, as you can tell. If you think I've missed anything or I'm just way off the mark on a lot of these things, I'd love to hear your opinions down below. Negative, positive, call me a fool. I'm happy to hear it. I just want to hear as many perspectives on this as possible. I hope I did a good job of just showing off what the new structure is going to look like. Let me know how that changes your plans going into the next season. For full transparency, I'm not going to be chasing an invite next year. I'm really excited to see the season rewards, and I think we have to get that information sooner rather than later to create a more full opinion of the structure, and I'm mildly terrified that we're getting less rounds in tournaments. Those are just my takes. I'll hear yours down below. Thanks so much for watching, and I'll see you tomorrow for another video. Cheers.